Alright, so I fell down a rabbit hole and I'm not 100% sure exactly when I'm going to escape from it. Hi everybody, welcome back to A Well-Read Nerd. So this video is weird. It's weird because I had a thought, and I let the thought vacillate for probably far longer than it needed to in my head. But it came about after I finished up my review for King of Battle and Blood. If you haven't seen my review, click up there. And it just got me thinking, why exactly do we find vampires sexy? Like, what is it about this ostensibly monster that our society, specifically Western society, has decided to denote as in some way inherently sexual? Hot, if you will. And so I sat down on my laptop a few weeks ago, and I've been working on a few other ideas tangentially connected with vampires anyways, and I figured, you know what? Let me do some research, I'll pull some stuff up, it'll be a cute little follow-up video. This isn't going to be a cute little follow-up video because I'm not sure if I have the answer. And this video is more so about my jumping off point with how little I actually knew about the origins of vampires in popular culture. So this is more of an origin of how vampires became sexy, because I don't really think you could look at the modern vampire as it is today, as we see it in whatever new vampire thing is coming out. Are there any new vampire things coming out? Morbius is currently tanking its box office, but it includes a ripped Jared Leto, so I guess sexy, if you're into that. Like, in order to get into why that's a thing today, we kind of have to delve into where it even came from, which is super complicated. Now, everybody knows the big name vampire of the 19th century, which is Dracula. We're not even really going to talk about Dracula today. I'll probably make a video about that soon for various reasons. Most of them would spoil the video. But I start off with that, and I knew a few things. I like to read 18th and 19th century literature. I like the different perspectives. I studied history in college along with philosophy. So, like, things like older literature is appealing to me from that sense. But when I started digging into it, the more I realized that, like, Dracula was sort of like the climax, if you will, of something that had been brewing in literature for a very long time. And that's mostly what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go over some things that I didn't know that maybe you don't know, or maybe if you do, then you just know way more about vampire literature than I do, and good on you. But yeah, we're just going to dive right in, and I'm going to start in my deconstruction of the fact that I knew nothing about vampires. As vampires in literature, by the way, I know how to kill a vampire. Everybody knows how to kill a vampire. You have to, like, put a rock in their mouth, right? Like, that's how you do it. You just put it in and then they're dead. But while we're talking about this, let's go ahead and let's just go to the beginning of how this even became a movement. Now, if anybody is unfamiliar with late 18th century, early 19th century literature, there was a large movement in specifically English literature and North American English literature that moved towards the idea of Romanticism. Now, Romanticism isn't like what we would think of today. The Romantic movement, as it's talked about, doesn't really have anything to do with, like, romance, like kissy kissy, mwah, mwah. Not really with the romance that they're talking about. The romance that they're talking about is sort of like this ideal of strong emotion and a more, like, bucolic existence, away from the Industrial Revolution, back to a simpler time. It's an overly romanticized ideal about what the past was like and how it was so much better. Which, by the way, English is a funny language. There's actually a word for that. It's called quixotic. Vocabulary for the day. But with this movement, it was sort of tangentially moving also with the Gothic movement. Now, again, not goth like today, but there you can see the roots of today's goth movement in the Gothic literature of the past. Specifically the fact that Gothic literature had this macabre, supernatural element to it. Prior to the 19th century, pretty much everything I've seen with like Gothic and Gothic romanticism was pretty much crystallized in poetry. You got a lot of poets writing about long lost loves, returning from the grave, things like that. A lot of Poe's work could be seen as being similar to that. The Raven definitely has that Gothic romanticism to it, more so the Gothic than the romantic. There's others that I read that seem to blend the two more together, but that was staunchly, from what I can see, in the poetry aspect. It wasn't really for long form literature, short stories, plays, or novels. But the idea of it was there and people were reading it. When we get to something resembling Gothic literature is really the beginning part of the 19th century. There are a few, like I said, a few examples beforehand, but most of them didn't really imbibe like both the ideas of romanticism and Gothic. They were sort of their own separate things, except for in poetry where they had a lot of overlap. But then you come to the early part of the 19th century. A whole new era of rich kids with nothing better to do with their time besides sit around and write. It's the truth. And during this time, you have a lot of later influential works. This is a time of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the first science fiction novel. But that was also a book that exemplified those Gothic undertones and romanticism. So in a lot of ways, it took those two movements and blended them together and arguably created an entire new genre through it. But the reason why I'm talking about Shelley's Frankenstein is because the same party, I think it was at Lake Geneva in Switzerland, where her and her lover slash husband, I can't remember if they were married at the time, Percy Shelley accompanied several friends, one of which was Lord Byron. If you're unfamiliar with how she came up with it, there was a contest, again, a bunch of bored, rich young people finding something to do with their time, where they all had to create stories. Mary Shelley created Frankenstein. Lord Byron, who was the famous poet and playboy, pictured here, wrote down what is only referred to as a fragment of a story, fragment of a novel, is how it's worded. It does deal with a vampire. However, there is not enough book there or novel there to really flesh out any ideas about vampires, besides things that were already prevalent in folklore at the time, which is vampires are scary and they eat people. Really, the only thing Byron contributed to vampires was the fact that he had a way with poetry to begin with that I think sort of trickled down into this like cultured, learned persona being identified with vampires. It's just the way he wrote. I think it was just people remembering more so Byron than the characters that he wrote, because the story itself is just basically about a vampire who comes back from the dead and eats his family, or tries to eat his family. I couldn't find that one when I looked for it online, even though it's very old. But the reason why Byron is so important isn't really because of what Byron did with writing the novel. It's more so about the importance of Byron as a person. Because the arguably first vampire novel to be written was written by Byron's personal physician, John William Polidori. And it was simply called The Vampyre. Now, the reason why Polidori's novel is arguably more important than Byron's blink and you'll miss it contribution to vampiric literature is the fact that in it you get the first essence of a seductive vampire. Vampires were scary, they were dangerous, but Polidori is the first person to make them appealing. And that might in large part be the influence of Byron as a person in Polidori's life. We all know, anybody who studied literature knows about Byron. He couldn't keep it where it needed to go, and it kind of went everywhere. And the homoerotic undertones in The Vampyre definitely, I could say, could have a postmodernic interpretation as Polidori working through his own either unrequited or jilted affections towards Byron. There's a lot you could unpack there. It's been speculated. I will say the fact that of how Polidori wrote the main character in The Vampyre as this seductive, worldly, I think it was a count or a baron, so nobility, who basically goes around and does what he wants and doesn't care who he hurts and takes what he wants, but he's very seductive about it. I wouldn't be surprised if Polidori was working through some issues about Byron. But there's that. But the reason why this is important, like I said, is because Polidori was the first one to make the vampire seductive. He was arguably the first one for a long time that did that. Because after Polidori's Vampyre, which was turned into plays, things were added to it. You know, it was an inspiration for several operas and things like that that added to the mythos surrounding vampires. There really wasn't a lot in literature for a while. The next big thing to happen in vampire literature was a penny dreadful by the name of Varney the Vampire. Now, Varney is important because while Polidori made vampires seductive for the first time, Varney was the first one to give us any mythos about vampires. Meaning that before, vampires were mostly constituted as these things that come back from the dead and they drink your blood. Varney, which, if you're not familiar with, it was a penny dreadful, I'm not sure if I said that. Penny dreadful is basically a little cheap cereal that you could buy. Meaning, like, every so many weeks or every week they would have a new episode in paper form that you would go pay a penny for, and it would be the next episodic adventure of whatever characters you're interested in. It's actually where the character of Sweeney Todd first appeared. He was a character that appeared in several penny dreadfuls during this time. When did this come out? Just a minute. So Varney actually came out in 1847. The Vampyre by Polidori came out in 1820. So there's a good 27-year gap between these two. And in that time, like I said, there wasn't a lot added to vampiric literature. Varney has some of those seductive qualities that Polidori put in his novel, but not really. More of a genialness from what I can see. I read several of them. They're available, about half of them, because there's about 300 and some odd chapters or individual serials that were written. About 100 and 150 of them are available for free on the Gutenberg Project. I'm going to link that and some of the other ones that are available on there free for reading down below if you guys are interested. There didn't seem to be like that overly seductive quality. There seemed to be a like I said, a genialness, a nobody would suspect kind of deal, which does play into later vampire literature as well. Probably gave a lot of people a lot of ideas to work with. But the important thing about Varney, which is something you don't even think about, it's the first time that anybody's found where they mention that vampires have fangs, which you don't really think about. Like, you don't think about, like vampires have fangs, it's how they bite people. But apparently up until the two people that wrote this, who was it? Until Reiber and Prest, who are the two people who wrote the Varney penny dreadfuls, until they came along, nobody actually asked how do creatures with blunt teeth bite people enough to draw blood without just like ripping their throat out entirely. So they added that to the mythos. There wasn't a whole lot else added to it, but that was an important thing that I found, besides just keeping vampires in the cultural zeitgeist, because it was a form of cheap, sensationalized entertainment. There's that, because the vampires still at this point have not mentioned that they can't go out in the sun. There's no mention of mirrors. There's no mentions of any special powers. Not like you would think of special powers. There's no need to be invited. I didn't even see anything about like garlic or anything. Some overt references to religious artifacts, but I would assume that would just be the opinion of the day that religious artifacts would repel evil, so it would make sense. Yeah, Varney is something that's overlooked a lot, I think, by people who are looking at vampire literature, just because it is such a lowbrow form of entertainment. But I think without it there, like, we wouldn't even have gotten to some of the later works in 19th century literature, because I'm not sure if vampires would have stayed in the mindset as long if they weren't these little cheap forms of entertainment that kept them at the forefront of people's minds, like Varney did. But with that, our next thing is going to take a little bit of a different turn, but it's important to go here because without this novel and its resurgence in popularity, I don't feel like we would have the same opinions about vampires going into the 20th century. So let's go ahead and let's talk about Carmilla. Roughly another 20-year jump, an almost 30-year jump between Varney and Carmilla. But Carmilla was a novel written by Sheridan Le Fanu in 1872. I'm looking at my laptop, it's fine. I can't remember everything and I don't have a teleprompter. But Le Fanu wrote Carmilla, like I said, a while after Varney had peaked in popularity, 20 some odd years, which seems to be a pattern. When I was researching this, in between these spikes of like really remembered vampire novels in the 19th century, you do have a lot of plays and operas, which were very popular. And I think that's important because you have to remember, even though literacy was on the rise in the 19th century, there were a lot of people who still couldn't read or who couldn't access books because they were prohibitively expensive. However, plays and operas were a little bit cheaper for people to be able to afford and a little easier for them to understand. More so plays and operas. Operas were a little bit more highbrow, but there were plenty of just regular plays that were popular. And I think that's important because I think looking at this, they fed into each other. The plays copied some of the earlier books because they'd read the books, the people who wrote the plays and the operas. And then they turned around and put their own spin on it, and then 20 years later somebody else came along and they wrote a book that was influenced by a play that somebody had written after being influenced by a book. In the 19th century, there seems to be a symbiotic relationship between those two, especially with such a niche genre. And I think that's fascinating because we really wouldn't think about that today. I mean, we see it a little bit with movies and books, where if there's a book that's popular, they turn it into a movie. And then people who have never read the book to begin with will turn around and read the book because they watched the movie. So it's that symbiotic relationship. And like I said, that's very interesting, and that's something we can even parallel with today when we're talking about vampire novels. You have Twilight. You have the new Blade movie coming out in a few years. There are people that only read the book because they watched the movie, and there are people who only watched the movie because they read the book, and who built on ideas like that in movies and went on to make other books, or people who read books that went on to make other movies. I think some people would probably think that that's a 20th and 21st century thing, but it turns out it was a 19th century thing too, and I find that symbiotic relationship very fascinating. But now getting into Carmilla, which recently, last year, a couple of years ago, had a movie adaptation, which is also just the generic movie adaptation or movie trend that Hollywood seems to be very excited about right now, which is repressed lesbian and period clothing. I say that because I watched the movie. It deals more with that than it does vampires, but if that's your thing, repressed lesbian in period clothing, go watch it. It's actually pretty good for that. But the book itself deals much more in, not explicit. It's not explicit at all, like you're thinking through a modern lens. It would have been extremely explicit for Victorian times. But it mostly follows a girl who is seduced by a vampire, a female vampire. Ooh, the scandal. So, harkening back to Polidori's novel, you do have this homoerotic undertone to vampire stories. Homoeroticism is viewed as wrong in the culture at the time. So to see an outlet for those through the lens of a monster is very fascinating. It's very reminiscent of other things that happened in the 20th century, which maybe I'll make a video about as I continue down my dive. I just find it fascinating that you take the lens of homoeroticism and you're putting it through the vampire. Carmilla goes a long way towards further sexualizing vampires because of that. Because in the time in which it was written, any relationship between two people of the same sex or gender would have been considered inherently erotic. So by placing the female vampire and the female victim here and the cat and mouse back between them, you're implicitly making it a sexual situation, given the context of the time. Now today you could have that and it might not have the same feel to it depending on who's doing the material. However, at the time, yeah, definitely, that was the intention, the scariness of two women in such a way, and the scariness of sexuality. Polidori didn't really have a fear of the sexual. It was something that was scary that was also sexual. Varney didn't really have any sexuality at all. It was just an interesting interlude of updating the vampire, making the vampire likable in some way, sympathetic. But then when you get to Carmilla, it's like you have a 180 where Le Fanu takes everything that came before and goes like, yes, but it's all tied together and it's all bad. Like, he took the things that Varney added with fangs and the overall appealingness of vampires, and he put that in Carmilla. And then he took Polidori's naturally sexual vampire and he put it in Carmilla. So you have a sexually liberated, personable, almost bordering on sympathetic vampire in Carmilla. Because there's a sense of loneliness in her character that can be read, of wanting somebody with her, which is understandable. Le Fanu does not extrapolate on that. It is probably something that went right over his head and is only read into by people later. But when he was working all of these elements into Carmilla, with that, he very much took it and twisted it in a way that nobody had before. Polidori didn't view his character's sexualness as inherently evil. He was an evil person who was sexual. Varney, with his genialness, wasn't necessarily... His genialness made him a sympathetic antagonist. It never came across like his genialness was the cover for his evil. He was a bad person who was also very fun to get along with, which could be said a lot for a lot of people in life. But with Le Fanu's Carmilla, like, you have the sexual creature in Carmilla, you have the agency, you have the genialness from Varney, you have all of these past things worked into a character that arguably would make for a very fascinating antagonist. But Le Fanu puts it in such a way where it seems wrong. Like, when I read The Vampire, and I read parts of Varney, they were stories about vampires, but the vampireness was never perceived as wrong by the other characters. They were vampires, and they interacted with non-vampires. And vampires did bad things, but that was it. The vampires did bad things. They were villains. With Le Fanu, it became apparent that he viewed all of the aspects of Carmilla's character as evil. Or she had those characteristics because she was evil. There was no nuance to that. It was, well, she likes other women. Evil. She has sexual agency. Evil. She's a woman that seems to be able to get other people to like her. Evil. And it's interesting. Maybe it's because Carmilla is the first female protagonist. Both Polidori and, I keep saying Varney. Varney's the name of the vampire, but we are only loosely sure who actually wrote it, even though I gave you a couple guys' names. They both had male protagonists. This was the first female protagonist. And I think this might be a little bit of a lens into just the views Le Fanu had of women in general. Perhaps if he had written the same plot of Carmilla without it being a woman, which I don't even think he would have done, just I think in his mind it had to be a woman. But if it had been a male protagonist, I don't think the same twist on it would have come. I don't think the sexuality or sensuality of Carmilla, if she had been a male antagonist, I don't think it would have come across with the same undertones that Le Fanu put in to Carmilla as a female character. And that's interesting. Like, that's very interesting. And something you can even see into 20th century with female villains. That sometimes the actions are seen as more villainous because it's a woman who does them. But, like, I found that fascinating just in general because it's first female vampire. It's first lesbian vampire. And it's, like, over, 100 years old. But it is definitely, that's not a liberating thing. It's definitely through the lens of a 19th century Caucasian male. Which is not the best lens to put those things through. Just saying. But yeah, I found that fascinating. I found that there's been a resurgence of interest in Carmilla. Before I started researching this, I never read Polidori's The Vampire. I only vaguely knew who Polidori was, in reference to Byron. And I'd certainly never read Varney the Vampire. So both of those are things which led up to Carmilla, which I had read before, it was interesting to get a new perspective on how it had changed and how somebody else put a spin on it through their own personal opinion. Now at this point, this has gone on long enough. This is just my thing of try to explain what I found and everything. So now I'm just going to do a recap of my conclusions with this. But I feel like if you read modern vampire literature or indulge in modern vampire media of any kind, and you don't know these stories, that's fine. You don't need to know these stories in order to enjoy what came later. However, if you're somebody who likes trends and likes to see how literature influences itself, how things change over time, these are probably going to be fascinating stories for you to read. If you've never read anything besides Dracula and you hated it, definitely try some of these because they're a lot different than Stoker's interpretation of a vampire, and I think that's a good thing. I do think it's nice to know these things, though. Even if you don't take the time to read these, if you watch my video and you have a familiarity with these things later, it might mean that you get a different interpretation out of the next book that you read, and that's always fun and interesting. But the real conclusion is I still don't know why. That's what I'm focusing on. That's what I'm working on. This was just the first part of it. Was me sharing the interesting things I found while I go through this, and the fact that the sensuality of vampires has sort of been hard-baked there since the beginning, but in a different way, and that still doesn't explain to me why it transfers into later. So I'm going to keep researching. I'm going to keep looking at this. I'm going to keep delving into it because I find it fascinating. And I'm going to be sharing my research along with you guys because I want to. I took the time and the hours to do it. Why not? And I want other people to be familiar with these things that are interested in them. Maybe you don't have the time to do what I did and just binge research for 12 hours over the course of a couple of weeks. Maybe you have a life. But you can watch my video and now you know. The more you know. So I hope you got that out of this. If you have any questions, if you have any comments about anything that I talked about, like what did you think about finding out about the first vampire novel by Pelladori? Do you think they should turn Varney the Vampire into a TV show? Because I totally think they should, because it actually sounds fascinating. So comment down below if you agree with me. I would, if Netflix did like greenlight that tomorrow, I'd be like, well, I know what I'm going to do when that drops. I'm just going to binge the entire thing. What are your thoughts about Carmilla? Do you agree with me? Do you think that La Fanu put a spin of a villain on a character who wasn't necessarily a villain just because of her sex? Let me know. Any other random thoughts that you have. They're fun. But that's going to be it for this first part. I am currently researching away on whatever happens next. I have some fascinating things about Dracula, which I might share with you guys. It just depends on how they pan out. I'm still doing a little bit of research. Then I just always wanted to be able to say Wallachia on my channel and say it correctly. But if you guys had a good time here, you want to see more, you want to see the rest of this as I slowly figure it out, please subscribe. Like if you want to. It boosts my ego. That needs all the help it could get. But that's going to be it for today. Come back, check out what I've got coming up. I'm going to keep working on stuff and I'm going to share it with you guys. But with that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. Honest question. Who takes vampire lesbian novel and then takes out all of the interesting parts and just gives us melodrama and milquetoast lesbian? I really didn't like that movie. Would not recommend.